Hello and welcome to part 2 of my boat seat upholstery. This is where we left off. If you want to check out video number 1 of this series, you can click on the link in my description. In this video I'll show you step by step how I pattern these pieces and sew them all together to make my boat seat cover. First I'll start with this scrap piece of leftover material I have. These pieces fit on it perfectly. If I had marked my cover on the outside, I would use a piece of chalk like this, or a removable marking device on the outside, but I draw everything on the inside, so I will use a pencil on the back side. All of the seam allowance from the original cover is trimmed off, so I will draw my own seam allowance amount outside of this cut piece. This allows me to adjust my seam allowance size for different seams that I like to sew. I like to take my time here and make sure all of my line-up marks are properly transferred to my new pattern and my outside edges are fairly crisp so I can cut a nice clean edge. This is the difference in my seam allowance here. The one with 2 notches is slightly smaller than the one with the 3 notches over here. Also make sure I transfer my cushion number and my arrow direction. These will help me put the pieces together later on. These are the different types of stitches I was talking about. That one's a double stitch there where you can see it, and this other one over here has nothing visible. I'll just clean up some of my straight lines here with my little square. So for these bigger pieces I can use a weight to hold them down. This is just a chunk of steel with an old car spring welded to it for a handle, but you can use anything like this, piggy bank, a bowling ball, anything that will hold your material down and not wreck anything underneath of it. So this is what I do with my little line-up marks here. I just fold it right on the line and then I can take a little slice off it and it makes this little V notch missing. So when I sew it to foam I can still see it and I can line the pieces up together while I'm sewing them. This piece is a little bit strange looking. It was pulled really tight around the bottom so it shrunk quite a bit in the corners. So I'll slice this one open and that way I can lay it flat where it sits on the foam and get a nice clean pattern from it. This material already has the foam on the back of it. These other materials don't have foam, so I'll need to cut my own and sew them together. This is just a thin sew foam material, meaning it has a thin layer of material on the back side of the foam for sewing purposes. Not all upholstery or boat upholstery has foam on the cover, but these do, and I'm matching some existing seats in the boat, so I'm trying to make them look as close as possible to the originals. Here are my pieces, and because I marked them on the back, I need to make sure I transfer my marks to the back side of the foam. An added step, of course, but if you mark everything on the front, you should be good to go. Let's sew these together. Of course, my bobbin runs out just as I get started. I keep my stitch real close to the edge here on the vinyl. All the pieces sewn and scattered across my table. This is the time where I bring back the old stuff. At this stage, it's like a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. I just got to figure out where all these pieces go and in what order I'd like to sew them in. Alright, this is starting to make some sense now. It's all coming back to me. Golden. At this point, I'll take some time to look at what seams I'd like to sew together first. Alright, let's stick some of these pieces together. In these areas that I know I'll be sewing over my multiple seams here, I cut the seam allowance off real close to my stitch. That way it doesn't have a big lump of material on the back when I sew all the pieces together. So this next stitch is where I added some extra seam allowance in my pattern. You can see it has a double stitch or a French seam. I'll just make some minor relief cuts here in my seam allowance so we can flip freely onto the back. These are just some relief cuts I'm making so my seam allowance can flip nicely on each side at the back. I always back my double stitches or French seams with this material. This is just a scrap piece of some seat bottom lining. It's fairly thin and durable, and it won't rip when I sew through it or pull on it. In the past, I've used some scrap vinyl or any kind of thin material, as long as it has some flex or stretch that it can go around the corners easily without being seen. Moving right along here. This seam here does need a piece of fabric sewn to it that will hang down in between the two pieces of foam and be stapled to the board on the boat seat. And for that I just have this scrap piece of vinyl from another job. I draw lines on it just as a reference mark for foam thickness in the staple line, and then I can line up my 1/2 inch line there onto my seam allowance. So this is my finished seat cover here. At this point I like to look at all of my seams on the back and see if I need to trim any before installing it on the cushion. Okay, so my boat seat cover here is complete. We'll just send this off to the install department. Oh wait, that's also me. Thanks for watching.